Okay, so the topic seems to be left and right populism, the way I first selected it. But in fact, today we will talk about left populism primarily through the work of Chantal Mouffe. Udipta was kind enough to send us an essay of his, so I will leave room for him to comment. And you have also read something by Gene Cohen. I read a complex piece, which I will not review, except to mention that it represents relatively close to what my own position on these matters is. I could have assigned another piece by Carlos de la Torre, which was published in the Irish Journal of Sociology, of all places, in 2019. Is left populism the radical democratic answer? It's also a piece that I read for this session. But primarily I focus on Mouffe, which I read a couple of times this week, and it's the third time then that I would have read it. And I must say that the more I read it, the less I like it. Not so much because of disagreement, because in fact, one could almost portray her work as representing a political position fairly close to mine, except for the use of the term populism for it. It's not so much disagreement, it's rather, I think, the thinness of the argument, which is striking. But it makes it easy to reconstruct it, so that's what I will try to do, and make some critical remarks during the second half, as you'll see in my outline. The first part will be a reconstruction of her proposal. Then I will ask the question of its relationship to Ernesto Laclau, that Udipta too handles in his paper, and then some critical remarks toward the end. So what, of course, is the question for us? That's the first thing to deal with. And after we have dealt with the causal role of economic and cultural challenges in our epoch behind what, for example, Mouffe calls the populist moment, others call it the age of populism. The question for us is assuming that we're living in an age in which populism has become very important, is a response, should our response be left-wing version of populism? In other words, assuming the problem, assuming the character of the epoch, is left populism the answer? Of course, you know that Chantal Mouffe's theory represents a very positive answer to that question. So much so that it doesn't seem to be even that there is another alternative outside of the reigning technocratic views that appear both on the right and the left. Right-wing populism and left populism, they seem to be the universe of political possibilities today for her. So what's the analysis on which this is based? It's interesting. I tend to agree with a good part of that analysis. And in fact, I've presented something analogous to it, not relying on her, but relying on authors like Danny Roderick, others who have written on the cultural dimension as well. But let me just restate her own view, which has to do with the crisis of the current epoch, as she presents it, the neoliberal hegemony or the neoliberal political, cultural, economic paradigm has replaced the post-war welfare state paradigm that was dominant, at least in the Western world, maybe under somewhat different headings like import substitution, economic populism. It was dominant also in Latin America and elsewhere. This integration was replaced by as you said, neoliberalism, understood in simultaneously political, economic, and cultural terms. And now it is this formation that is also in crisis, which is the meaning of the populist moment. It's both a sign of the crisis of neoliberalism and a response to it. Now, following Cullen Crouch, whom I also to some extent drew on, Chantal Mouffe sees the neoliberal epoch primarily from a political perspective, and so calls it post-democracy, a term used by Crouch and by Jacques Rancière, it seems as well. The meaning is, as we have seen, that we have continued to use and rely on the liberal democratic formal institutional framework, but that formal institutional framework has lost its democratic character. It's linked to a demos, which in the social democratic period, whatever the bureaucratic deformations and substitutions involved, was nevertheless alive. Social democracy is a response to popular needs and demands. Neoliberalism breaks with that, separating the liberal and democratic parts of the earlier synthesis. Post-democracy, structured by both corporate power and globalized framework of constraints, makes it impossible for political institutions, political parties, political leaders to respond to the very real needs of the populations having to do with economic welfare and some extent also, Chantal Mouffe doesn't stress it, social status. This leads then to the critique of the so-called third way, on which Mouffe spends a lot of time. And I assume that her previous writings spend more time as well. A critique in the British context where she lives. I don't know if she lives there now, but where she lived at the time of writing most of her books. This was a critique of Tony Blair and Anthony Giddens, the theorist of the third way, having to do with the fact that social democratic parties, including British Labour, adopted the perspective of economic rationalization, of austerity programs, and in Tony Blair's phrase, the choice was not no longer to replace one economic system by another, or even to radically alter it through reforms, but to manage it well. This is New Labor in the United States, sometimes under also a heading of New Democracy. The Clintons associated with this. What sometimes Nancy Fraser, for example, calls progressive neoliberalism. Progressive in the sense that in the left-wing form, cultural needs of many constituencies, including women, ethnic minorities, races, are paid attention to. Progressive neoliberalism, too, could be described in a Rawlsian manner as allowing the economic marketplace and those who dominate it make the fundamental decisions, but protecting the ones who are worst off. This is the third way. And as you know, Chantal Mouffe thinks that classical Marxism does not represent a possible response to these third-rate ideologies. This is where I think Udipta has, I think, some doubts, although exactly his own relationship to classical Marxism doesn't become entirely clear in his piece. But in any case, to Mouffe and to Clau, who come from Althusser and from classical Marxism, because of its essentialism, class-based essentialism, cannot respond to the post-democratic moment, and it cannot because even the progressive neoliberals have learned to pay a great deal of attention to the variety of movements, initiatives, challenges, demands emerging in their societies. Classical Marxism, because it simply wants to focus on class, cannot do so. Chantal Mouffe thinks that class should not be entirely forgotten and proposes a theory which in her mind brings together both the new identity-based cultural challenges and the original class-based challenges in a new synthesis. What is surprising is that she thinks that right-wing populism in a way anticipates what she has to say, paying attention both to cultural and to economic needs, and providing, as I already said, not only a sign of the crisis of the neoliberal integration, but providing a possible answer, alternative to one that she will reject, but rejects it carefully. She even says in some places that one must avoid the demonization of right-wing populism. Interestingly, Clau used the term demonization for his version of the frontier of antagonism, as it is called. We should avoid the demonization. We should learn both strategy and a form of appeal from right-wing populism, bifurcated into two here, learning from Thatcherism, which is also interpreted as a populism, because Thatcherism at least knew how to draw a radical frontier of antagonism, and from the nationalist versions too, which with the crisis of the integration that Thatcher helped to establish, provide a clue to what must be addressed by the left. Now, of course, already anticipating left-wing populism will be different than right-wing populism in its relationship to the definition of who the people are who are going to be mobilized, and in its relationship with democracy too. In her conception, left-wing populism is not exclusionary in the sense of right-wing populism, and responds to democratic norms and values. So that's the overall frame. The question I want to raise, and Udipta addresses it too, but I'm not sure if our answers are the same, is that Mouffe tries on the formal theoretical level to use Ernesto Laclau's work to generate the left-wing version of populism. Everybody here knows they were married. I have nothing against husband and wife riding together, although it leads to some tensions. I think in their case, I feel more of a tension than in our case. That's not because I know the people, or I knew Ernesto. He passed away, unfortunately, but because of the considerations that I'm going to introduce now. I don't believe that anyone could do that to either Jean or me right now. What I'm about to do to Ernesto and Chantal. In other words, I asked the question: is this a critique or a domestication of Clau? Obviously, it's an antagonistic question, because Chantal Mouffe would say, no, it's not a critique, it's not a domestication, it is the proper use. It is a proper use of Clau's theory. That's what she would have said. That's what she implies. There's not a word of actual criticism here, and I think it requires what we would call a careful reading to see that this is both a critique and a domestication, because I think it is both. It domesticates Clau, who actually did not want to be domesticated. In other words, it's a critical perspective that leads to the necessity of changing in some significant respects the work of Clau. I include page numbers here, which I don't always do in the outline, which of course you are free to use as you wish. But my first citation has to do already with I think what is a significant departure, namely the matter of definition. In his book Unpopulist Reason, bottom of page 10, Clau defines populism as a discursive strategy of constructing a political frontier, dividing society into two camps, and calling for the mobilization of the underdog against those in power. I have my copy of Clau in Connecticut, and it's a pity that I don't have it here. Maybe one of you have it handy and can look it up. I don't remember Clau actually saying that he's defining populism, and certainly to the extent that one can reconstruct a definition from his work, it's going to be more than just this. I mean, on a definitional level, Clau speaks also about an empty signifier, which accomplishes the work of creating a chain of equivalences. He also speaks about populism requiring friend-enemy relations, and moreover, he also stresses leadership in a different way than Mouffe is going to stress. Perhaps most importantly for him, populism is equivalent to the political understood in a strong sense, meaning the use of political means for the creation, the foundation of regimes. So I think that just on the face of it, Mouffe transforms a relatively thick treatment of populism to a thin definition. I spoke about these matters already before, about the problems of thick and thin, too thick, and we will have only a single case. I accused Finkelstein of ultimately having only a single case of Argentina. A thin definition, on the other hand, will have too many cases and inevitably include everything popular and radical democratic under the same heading. I think this is the latter risk that Chantal Mouffe runs, whereas I think in terms of at least the definitional aspects, Clau got the phenomenon just right. Yes, under a Clauian treatment, you would not be including the American populists, but that's not a loss. I think that is actually a gain for clarity. Now, Mouffe addresses almost all the issues that Clau used for his description and analysis of populism in his sense, but she changes. She changes almost all the characteristics. For example, popular sovereignty, which certainly Clau treats in terms of an embodied presence. I mean, remember the critique of Lefort, where the idea of the empty space is criticized. No, the empty space must be filled, says Clau, meaning, of course, that popular sovereignty has to be present, has to be embodied, has to be actually exercised. For Chantal Mouffe, though she mentions the word popular sovereignty in lots of places, the only place where I actually find it described on page 17, popular sovereignty is an agonistic contest between competing political forces. That's very Lefortian, an agonistic context, but none of them, of the contenders, are in the center, except perhaps at the most in terms of their aspirations, or in terms, or only temporarily. So that is a shift. She plays with Schmitt and Lefort just like Clau played, but the idea of filling the empty space is never really mentioned. So that's popular sovereignty. In her very short, what I call the thin definition, the underdog is mentioned. But in the rest of the text, you don't find any particular underdogs or the plebs as the carriers of the populist project. This should be connected to the problem of pluralism, where in the end she talks about not one we, but many we's. I'll return to that question in a second. You have this old issue of Clau and Chantal Mouffe, namely antagonism, which I have always thought, and I think one can demonstrate in terms of their writings, to be a adoption of Carl Schmitt's understanding of the political in terms of fundamental friend-enemy relations. In this work, as against Clau's book, that particular idea is criticized, the friend-enemy relationship. And now, however we are to understand adversarial relations or antagonistic relations, they are to be understood as milder or less dramatic or less antagonistic, if you want, less violent potentially than what you find in Schmitt. Ultimately, you will see, and this is a huge surprise and came to me only in the third reading, that she assumes a common value framework ultimately among the antagonists. With all these debates against Habermas, right, and Rawls having to do with consensus, right? In fact, that is a consensual element in her theory, which I didn't see there before. You know, of course, no one can interpret Habermas or Rawls or anyone as having nothing but a consensual model of all politics. That would be truly absurd, right? But there is a consensus theory in Habermas, namely that the reason that we can resolve our conflicts, have compromises, have agreements that last for a while before they are reopened, is because there is consensus about some ultimate frame. That has been denied, I think, by Mouffe and Clau, but she clearly returns to this, and this alters, I think, radically the meaning of antagonism and adversarial. There is the issue of leadership, where she insists on the need for it, but she uh, uh, contests the idea that it should have any hierarchical dimension. The leader should be only first among equals, primus inter pares. Charisma, yes, but charisma in a sense that does not produce a hierarchical relationship. Though Clau does not mention the concept of host ideologies, that returns here, or at least is adopted here by Chantal Mouffe, and it has to do with two possible hosts: democracy and socialism. Populism itself is insufficient, she says. That's a quote. In itself is insufficient. So in order to be sufficient, it must be either left or right. Well, that's the theory of host ideologies. Right, populism has as its host various versions of nationalist or ethnic or racial, even gender-based exclusion, possibly. And populism of the left relies, even though at times she seems to imply even socialism, the real host ideology in this book is democracy. And liberal democracy, that's the crucial, although highly ambivalent point, because on the one side, she repeats the Schmittian argument. This is the thing that Jean Cohen stresses in her piece, between liberalism and democracy being conflictual elements since early modernity. Liberal democracy is a contradiction in terms, which at least from the Schmittian point of view must be resolved either in an oligarchic liberal way or a democratic authoritarian or democratic dictatorial way. Now that is too far for Chantal Mouffe. She rejects the Habermasian idea of the co-originality of liberalism and democracy, but rejects the Schmittian idea of fundamental antagonism that allows for no compatibility. Quite creatively, I think, and I don't actually disagree with this, she thinks of the components as both conflictual and reconcilable, but only in the context of negotiation and conflict. There will always be some conflict between these dimensions, but they can be negotiated and in that sense resolved, at least temporarily, before the conflict reappears. It is something we have to live with. I tend to put something rather similar in my recent work in terms of constitutionalism and democracy within constitutional democracy. She does not stress the constitutional dimension very much, but in any case, it is in some way the same idea. In this sense, left populism is going to be different than either technocracy or right-wing populism. Technocracy because in the neoliberal period, it forgets the democratic dimension altogether, really de-emphasizes it and leaves only nothing but the formal feature of elections and some alternation in power from the democratic. But on the other hand, right-wing populism forgets the liberal. And in this sense, what she proposes is a polemical and critical attitude to both technocracy, which hardly is democratic, and right-wing populism is hardly liberal. In this sense, there is a three-way conflict that she wants to actually speak about. But in the three-way conflict, though she is not against using what she calls imminent critique in relationship to the two conflictual antagonists of left-wing populism, the term imminent critique is more justified in terms of the relationship to technocratic liberalism and then to right-wing populism. In any case, the imminent critique of technocracy leads, in her view, not to a revolutionary refoundation, but to a revolutionary reform in her terminology. So this is what the domestication of Laclau's perspective looks like. The natural question, is this still populism? There are quite a lot of parts of her book, which, for example, reminds me what we have written in our civil society and political theory several years before, and there is a possible interpretation of Mouffe that she has come over to that position. I mean, for example, the adherence to liberal democratic institutions, even as one criticizes the economic consequences of many of them, the desire to unite different strands of democracy, representative and direct, the idea of having a dualistic strategy between social movements and political parties is present here as well. Is this still a populism? I mean, it's a fair question. She tries to have her cake and eat it too. In other words, to domesticate Laclau and at the same time to remain in some ways in his camp. But it is an open question of whether she really succeeds, which cannot really be tested in terms of her theory alone. And I think we really have to speak about left populism independently to some extent of her theoretical statement of it. It is true that she has some examples of left populist politics to which she refers to, and as I think many of you know, she had a very close relationship to Podemos and Hirshon, one of his leaders, and so in this sense, she has a political reference, but on the whole, she does not really describe any left populism in actual political life. In this sense, leaving open the question of whether her theory is a normative set of recommendations, or it is actually meant to raise to a higher level what actually is already out there and is being politically mobilized. Just a few open questions which make it difficult to decide whether her conception is still populism. And let me point to these ambivalences one after the other. First, there is a restriction of the argument to Western Europe. That's really pretty amazing, given that the book is about left populism. And in Western Europe, you can find at most, I should watch it. I think I should not denigrate the very small, certainly 3 or 4 large projects that could be described as left populist and many, many small ones. But compared to Latin America, which we neglect, left populism is a relatively new and rare phenomenon, even compared to the United States. Populism in the European context, West European context, is relatively rare and recent. That, of course, would support her theory that we are now in an age of populism, where even Western Europe has gotten there. But still, others have gotten there before, decades before, anticipating the things, some of the things that she wishes to talk about, some of the critical perspectives as far as the positive ones. Latin America certainly is the huge absence here, given the fact that she's married to an Argentinian, has spent a lot of time there herself. Uh, this neglect is almost impossible to justify. And it is linked to another neglect, because with the very partial exception of Italy, in Europe, you cannot speak about any left populism having ever come to power. So Western Europe is a strange laboratory for understanding populism, because if indeed I'm right, as against the two of them, that populism has many organizational forms and personae, usually I rattle of movement, party, government, and regime, then Europe is not the ideal terrain where there is only the first two forms that ever appeared, and in a very partial way in Italy, the governmental form since Five Star participated in coalitions, now the second one. So in this sense, Europe is not the privileged place to study the phenomenon. Now, this absence is made into a doctrine here. And hopefully Udipta will tell me what it means, because I have difficulty fully understanding the idea that populism is not to be understood on the governmental or the regime level, that it is to be understood only as a project of a new hegemony. Well, I know the term comes from Gramsci, and Gramsci considered the achievement of hegemony to be part of a revolutionary strategy. But a revolutionary strategy, ultimately for Gramsci, as all Leninists and all Marxists too, has to do with the achievement of state power. Here, this is almost reversed. You try to achieve power in the state electorally. What's the purpose of that? Is to create a new hegemony. In other words, you need hegemony both to come to power, to win elections, and once in power, the purpose of power is to create a hegemony, or to generalize, or to spread that hegemony. Which to me means the dominance of cultural norms and values, which belong to the contending forces. I would not deny that is a thing that once in power populists do, but certainly there's no disinterest in government, form of government, regime, as indicated by their constant constitutional involvement and constitutional change, whether amending or making new constitutions, or packing constitutional courts to interpret and reinterpret the old ones. This you see everywhere. And even populists out of power, admittedly on the right, have constitutional proposals. I would think even Chantal Mouffe's idea of combining direct and representative democracy and their forms is a constitutional proposal of some kind. And so this means, of course, that one would not only aim at cultural hegemony, but also at the reconstruction and the reform transformation of the state. In this sense, the idea of what populism is about is, I think, misleading. It's not an answer that in different contexts populists would construct different forms of government. In some settings, it'll be for presidential government, in other settings for parliamentary. Some settings, they will stress the role of direct democratic devices more than in other settings. All that it may be true, but does not mean that that there's a disinterest in that level, but that once that level becomes relevant, to some extent, populism will rely on its host ideology. Uh, the fact that on page 51, she introduces a variety of ideas based on context: democratic socialism, eco-socialism, associated democracy, participatory democracy, indicates that this question would be central for any populism that comes to power. The most striking aspect, of course, is liberal socialism, the most striking name that she chooses in this context, indicating that even in the admitted contradiction between liberal and democratic elements in any democracy today, the liberal one could become extremely important. And in this sense, I think one can speak about only an ambivalence concerning the liberalism democracy in Mouffe, which is a new, certainly a new feature in her work with respect to Laclau's conception. So I'm pretty done with this presentation, and I know that it's a little oppressive that I'm singling out Udipta, but he has written a piece on this very author and the relationship of Hirshon to Laclau, and it's quite different, I think, in emphasis and in details even than mine. So I give the floor to him, and he uses as much or as little time as he wants to.
I don't have much to add. I think you've essentially the one issue, of course, where I think you and I would disagree is my skepticism over social democracy, and I think your endorsement for reviving social democracy of some kind. But we can leave that aside. I want to pick up on two things that you said, which I think are exactly right in my view. One is the issue of whether it's a domestication of Laclau. I mean, it clearly is a domestication. I'm not sure if it's a critique, but it's a selective appropriation. And as I understand it, there is one way to sort of comprehend why this is the case. Laclau, even though he was during his lifetime involved in concrete political projects, with the Kirchners in Argentina, for example, all of his texts were not necessarily conjunctural, in the sense that he never wrote a text which was meant to be giving advice to the left. He would present normative political theory. But Mouffe, this text, the character of this text is different. It is a manifesto. So in a sense, it would make sense that she wants to use Laclau as a strategy, or Laclau's theoretical elaborations in a purely strategic way. But this creates the serious problem that you have laid out, which is that she's forced to specify some kind of content to populism that Laclau's theory is certainly incompatible with in a way. So the question is whether or not it remains populism. And my way of thinking about this was to suggest that populism in Laclau's framework is a question of degrees, and Mouffe is essentially trying to say that we have to create a populism that we can control in a way. So domestication is exactly the right metaphor, I think. And the second issue is the emphasis, and this is related to the first point, the emphasis on agonistic tension as opposed to antagonism. Mouffe and Laclau as Andrew mentioned, have an intellectual trajectory that goes back to the 1980s with the famous book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And the project there was to formulate what radical politics can be without being revolutionary. Now, although they have written many texts together, they also have certain differences. And one of Mouffe's own contributions to this debate on radical democracy is this distinction between antagonism and agonism, or agonistic tension. An antagonism is precisely the Schmittian sense. It's a friend-enemy relationship where the enemy is not somebody you can have any kind of negotiation or meaningful political relationship with. But agonistic tension is one where there is a sort of conflictual but productive relationship. And the problem and the paradox of her argument here is to suggest that right populism and left populism are, in a sense, agonistic competitors. But the problem is obvious. And you can take this empirically. For example, someone like Trump, or Trumpism as a movement. If you say Sanders would view Trump as, or Trumpism as an agonistic competitor, the question is whether or not that recognition will be reciprocated by Trump or Trumpism. So whether or not right populism will view left populism as a agonistic competitor and not as an enemy. So this is the sense in which, if you want to contain and domesticate populism from the left, then you run into the problem, which is that right populism might not actually have the same sort of consensual affirmation for liberal democracy. So you have to exactly rely on the consensus on liberal democracy. If you follow someone like Federico, and his position is that populism precisely means that you abandon fascist or dictatorial politics of the past, and that is a purely post-fascist form, then maybe you can hold on to this argument that both of them have at least some sort of belief in the liberal democratic framework. But this is clearly not the case. Right populism can be more illiberal, and it has no problem or necessary difficulty in being illiberal. And so you can look at even Europe, the cases that Andrew was talking about, wherever there is a right populism, it does not necessarily view left populism as just an agonistic adversary. It views it as possibly an enemy, and as such will not have the same sort of relationship or same degree, or will have a higher degree of hostility towards left populist formations. And finally, the issue of why she is sort of Eurocentric and sort of reflectively Eurocentric. I don't have a big issue with it, but I think it reveals definitely a limitation, which is that the problem, I think, is the category of post-democracy. Post-democracy implies that there was a democracy before, and the democracy before is, for her, social democracies of Europe. Now, this argument is not going to work. The diagnostic is not going to work in the global south. And I think that's the problem. That's why she cannot talk about other places, even if we see that there is a sort of conjunctural moment spreads globally. It's not restricted only to Europe. So the post-2008 crisis, there have been effects of that globally. But if you rely on the concept of post-democracy, then you're kind of forced into thinking about only Western Europe specifically, and not engage with the question of the global south. And maybe if you have a broader perspective, maybe that will change things about how you rethink strategy and what needs to be done for the left. And finally, one last point. It seems to me that why she advocates left populism is that there is an urgency of the moment. If you don't have a left, if the left does not take a populist standpoint, if it remains reformist, that is centrist, center left, or it becomes more radical, so it becomes revolutionary, both of the other alternatives are bound to fail, and the right populism will win. So if you want to protect liberal democracy, you have to first defend it from right populism, and then take on the project of radicalizing it. What that radicalization means, I think I have reservations about. But again, empirically, we can think about what happened just in the US, and what has happened in France and Germany as well. So there are possible coalitions of the center left and the center right, which I think she discounts. Why she does not like them is that they will continue for her the crisis of neoliberalism. I think this is a fair criticism, perhaps, but nonetheless, this is an alternative. It's not the case that without left populism, a liberal democracy will be defeated. Liberal democracy might survive, but not. You're still going to have problems of welfare deficits and economic crisis. That perhaps is why she would say that the center left, center right coalition is not going to work. But in the US, things are different. There was actually a broader coalition of the center left, the left among the Democrats, and also some conservatives, some conservative factions. So there is still possible. One could say that there are still possible ways of coalitional politics that are not populist. So Biden is clearly not a populist, and even if his victory is marginal and cautionary, it nonetheless is a victory. So maybe the alarmism of her discourse or her diagnosis is overstated. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. So let's open the floor to the class, and then I can respond, and Udipta can respond as well if he wants to, and if somebody wants him specifically to address something also in his paper. So who wants to start?
I think that what you were saying about or what you just said about the center coalition of kind of like centrists and then center left liberals, center right conservatives, as something that is not completely, but really like works towards the United States and not elsewhere. I think it's super interesting that with like Brexit and everything in Germany, that doesn't necessarily work as well as a center coalition. I mean, it doesn't necessarily work perfectly in the United States, but I thought that was a really interesting point. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, although in Germany too, in a way, or in Europe, if you take Europe, the alliance between Macron and Merkel is essentially one of Christian Democrats and center left. But Biden, I think, was in a way successful in getting both the left of the Democrats, so the Sanders camp, and some of the centrist Republicans on board, which, yeah, I mean, I'm not happy about it either, but it was still it was a possibility. So,
see, there are two issues
definitely
involved in this. One issue is winning an election. That will, of course, depend on electoral rules, on local issues, also the kind of narratives parties offer. But the really fundamental argument here, I think Nancy Fraser makes it more emphatically even, is that even if centrism wins an election, it continues exactly the same crisis, the same decline, creating thereby a bigger and bigger opening for the right populists who differentiate themselves more radically and who don't mind even attacking the system, which the left populists, you never hear Bernie Sanders, whom I don't think that much of a populist, but doesn't matter, Fraser and Mouffe would think of him that way. He doesn't really attack the constitutional system except maybe a couple of features like the electoral college or the filibuster. but basically the constitutional system is accepted. It is much more challenged on the right. And given this ongoing crisis, that gives them an advantage. So yes, Biden can win, but it just means in terms of this theory, which is more radicalized by Nancy Fraser, is that the next time it's going to be even worse than Trump, the victory of the right. I got to be careful because Fraser has made points of this kind about Clinton, and I have not seen either Nancy or Eli Zaretsky address the Biden presidency. And maybe they have a somewhat different attitude to it. But the prediction would be that progressive neoliberalism is going to just make the victory of the right, which is unabashedly populist, all the greater. So this would mean that Le Pen is going to win in France, that Alternativa für Deutschland is going to do extremely well in Germany at some point, that it will be Salvini rather than Five Star that will win in Italy. That would be the prediction, right? You know, to say you can't win an election is one kind of prediction. That I think Biden has disproved, right? He won. He won by 7 million votes. A pretty significant difference. And if you really look at the Electoral College too, as bad as it is, it's a pretty big victory even there. But that's an election. Is this kind of governance going to make the problem even worse next time around? That's the thing that I think seemed to have been predicted in the past by Fraser, and is an implication of Mouffe, because there is no alternative except left populism to right populism. The technocratic thing was an alternative, but it's in crisis. It's becoming weaker and weaker, creating more and more inequality, victims, depolitization, post-democracy, all the rest that it does. And those who are hurt by this are looking for an alternative set of answers. And there are only two alternatives, left and right populism. I think that is this theory here. There are only three things: an outgoing technocracy and two populisms. And yeah, Biden disproves that, but that's a contingent fact. Macron would be an interesting case. People even use the expression populism of the middle. But in fact, he is pretty technocratic. Okay.
Of course, the logical consequence, the logical consequence of this is that there's going to be a radicalization of the right, and then Mouffe would be forced to argue for a greater radicalization of the left. So at some point, even left populism, which is constrained by liberal democracy, is not going to be enough. If you're facing fascists or populists who are really, really illiberal, then you're going to have to treat them as antagonists.
Yeah, because
that's what he wants to avoid.
Sorry, we have these strange mixes like Trumpism, right? Which on the one side carries on a populist rhetoric, on the other side makes all the compromises with the old-fashioned Republican oligarchy. So in that sense, you could say that Trumpism too prepares the ground for the next much more radical thing on the right without that betrayal. And so in that sense, you could say, in terms of a very pessimistic forecast for the future, that Trump and Biden are only preparing a possible American fascism. Well, let's not yet call it fascism, but you know what I mean. Adam, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a few questions. Feel free to answer any of them. The first is I'm confused by the relationship between Mouffe's criticism of post-democracy and Mouffe's usage of imminent critique. I guess this is my weekly question about imminent critique. She uses the term political imaginary, and I don't know how to understand that in terms of we are after democracy, we have lost these avenues of political engagement, yet we still seem to understand that people have an almost repressed or an almost latent sort of democratic hope. And I don't know why she thinks that. The second question, I'm confused as to how Mouffe understands how much we should learn from the right. So I understand this question of not viewing the right as a demon, but I'm not sure if Mouffe has a metric by which to say, this is when we've learned enough from the right, or this is when we can stop paying attention. Is that a misunderstanding of agonism, potentially? My third question concerns Udipta's introduction to Leclau's biography and Leclau's writing about events. Is there something about Leclau's theory itself that prohibits that, or is that more of a personal preference? This is just a lack of familiarity with Clau. And then the last question is not really a question, it's more of just a please talk about this. I was really, really interested in Mouffe's usage of Spinoza towards the end. That came out of left field, felt like we have never talked about anything even close to that, felt like the discussion of arts was very weird. Do you understand that as an underdeveloped section that isn't really that important? How do you understand that section?
Well, let me take a couple of these, and if he wants to. One is that, it's a device a lot of us use when we talk about modernity, about the fundamental imaginary signification that produces this very different kind of societies that we live in. And at least some people, in this sense, Claude Lefort and Cornelius Castoriadis would be the best examples, think of that as a democratic imaginary with some fundamental norms linked to it. Mouffe just mentions popular sovereignty and equality, but one could add participation, one could add accountability, one could add lots of other things to this, which we assume. And as against other interpreters of modernity, she would follow those who would say that these deep values are somehow part of what we assume about society, and it's very, very difficult for anyone to really escape them. But the reality, of course, is always a problem, and so that leads to tensions, which can be resolved in the direction of normative development toward more democratic society, but could lead to authoritarian outcomes also. In that sense, challenging the fundamental norms. I think fascism would be the best example of that. The last issue about Spinoza and the rest I can't really address. I'm now losing track of your second and third questions. If you could just remind me quickly what they were.
The second question was about the
learning from the right. Yeah. She seems to say that not only we should not demonize right-wing populists, but we should also take certain things from them. And the one thing she chooses is the nation or patriotism. I didn't think she was that communitarian in the past, but this seems to be a communitarian argument. It's for a lot of people, nation, patriotism, community are significant values, and we should not leave them to the right. But of course, this leads to tensions with other aspects of her proposal. For example, it's the liberals who really are much more open to other cultures, to people coming from other cultures, to alternative forms of religious life. And in that sense, learning from the right would be a problem for left-wing populism. I think that is the one dimension I noticed, which is a response to your question. And there was a third question, which
the third was about Udipta's introduction of Clau and concerned. So we talked about how Clau did not want to engage in political struggles, was a advisor of sorts, but wrote sort of more abstract theory. And I was asking whether there was something within the theoretical framework itself that justified that, or if it was only a biographical justification.
So Lipta, that's to you.
Yeah, I mean, I take that to be simply his style. I mean, I assume that he, I do believe that in Spanish, there are some writings that were more concrete interventions, more conjunctural writings, where he's giving sort of, let's say, policy advice or strategic advice to political actors. But in general, he would avoid, most of his works avoid the kind of writing that Mouffe is engaged in for left populism. Mouffe's other texts are actually not like this either. Other texts, Mouffe's, are also theoretical and normative. Yeah, I mean, the issue about the democratic imaginary. I mean, that's again fundamental to Mouffe and Laclau's whole project. They view what defines modernity for them in a way is the democratic revolution, and the democratic revolution is sort of an irreversible step, and it is characterized by the fluidity of social identity, the revolutionizing unfixity of collective identities. So what democratic revolutions make possible is the fact that political people can become political by formulating collective identities, like the nation, the proletariat, etc. So once the democratic revolution happens, which they locate with the French Revolution, there is a sort of irreversible trend. So this the populist logic is in a sense born with the French Revolution, and it is now endemic to.
I think that's completely right, and that's where populism comes in, because it's always been along with this democratic imaginary. You know, the sans-culottes of Paris challenged the legislatures as being oligarchic or not being democratic enough. In this sense, the two begin together, and given the thesis about post-democracy, which is stronger in Mouffe than it is in Laclau, but I think they assume it, populism becomes especially relevant because of a reversal in democratization. Udipta challenges this in his paper. Social democracy wasn't so democratic. And formally, I think that is correct, but nevertheless, by responding to material needs, it responded to the aspirations of the electorates who voted for social democrats, knowing that they were bureaucratic and even clientelistic, but who nevertheless produced the welfare state, which is, from this perspective, is a democratic achievement. So with the partial dismantling of that, with globalization, with deregulation of corporate power, there's a kind of democratic backsliding. It doesn't start with the new authoritarianisms, some of whom are populist. The democratic backsliding in this conception begins with Thatcher and Reagan and neoliberalism. And populism is a response to that, and it is a democratic response to it, irrespective now of the debate now of its own consequences, which they don't accept anyway automatically, right? So in this sense, populism is very much part of democracy. And yes, I think, there is something to be said for that, but it is also represents, to me, at least, the brittleness and the vulnerability of democracy to itself and to its own internal tension. Okay, so we answered that.
Just one.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I could also.
please.
Sorry. Yeah. Just one thing on the Spinoza issue.
Yeah, sure.
I think Adam raised the question. If I remember correctly, towards the end, it's a discussion on affects. Again, this is an issue that I believe Akansha had brought up last time. And the argument that Mouffe is making in the later pages, it's a synthesis of Freud, Wittgenstein, and Spinoza. The question is whether or not there can be hegemony in the sense that you establish a certain common sense, sensical view of the world. Whether there can be hegemony without libidinal and affective investment in whatever the view of the world is. So if you believe, for example, that United States is the greatest nation in the world, there has to be some sort of affective dimension to it. And yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with it. I think normatively, perhaps that's not, like Andrew, something that I would want to advocate. But she views that as sort of, that's a kind of realistic view of hegemonic politics. If you want to change the common sense of political life, you have to, there has to be an emotional content, emotional insertion into political life. And the problem with post-democracy is precisely that it erodes emotions. So populism is the inevitable and logical consequence of post-democracy. And what populism does, the opening it provides, has to do with the fact that it allows for emotions to enter. That's also, unfortunately, and paradoxically, the danger of it. So what you see now is a sort of emergency discourse where there is fear everywhere, and that is used to mobilize for political mobilization.
Okay, David, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just was wondering if you could expand on the idea of like taking the nationalism or taking the nation from right-wing populism, especially when left populism is also generally supposed to be anti-xenophobic and anti-racist. I just don't understand how those two things really correlate. So I was wondering if you could expand.
Well, I would say, Chantal Mouffe would say, we don't mean the nation the way they mean it, right? That would be right. I mean, first of all, already in the debate about nationalism, there is a debate between ethnic and civic, right? So when Le Pen says true French men and women, usually French men, but okay, she means people whose ancestors were French, going back to I don't know what. That's even in a country which is by international standards sort of universalist. But still, she makes that distinction. And so in that sense, the first step would be civic, right? Our nationalism has got to be civic. We want community, but not community only of people who can go back 10 generations and show themselves to be part of the same community. Surely race would have nothing to do with her idea. And of course, depending on different countries, that would be an issue to different extents. But the immigrants raise a problem here. I think David's asking the question is particularly relevant because it is here with the immigration problem that even in the very affluent Western countries, and some like the United States, which has no immigration problem, actually, the issue comes up. And then how do you deal with those? Not a question of whose parents, you look at, even Trump is a German name, right? So it's not a question of who your parents were, but at least you yourself should have been born here. Maybe, you should also be culturally like those others who are born here. And this question comes up because with immigration, there are cultural differences, clashes, and some countries, economic issues come up too, having to do with employment and so on. And I'm not entirely sure, you look at her text, I'm not entirely sure Chantal Mouffe does not go a little too far in accepting here the views of the right. Now, there have been people on the French left, even British left, who have on this issue moved slightly toward the right. And so in this sense, once you introduce this, David, I think you're entirely right. Once you introduce this, problems come up for that democratic conception which she has in mind. They are difficult in some countries and much less difficult elsewhere. I don't think Latin America, which has internal immigration, has the same kind of, which Cesar can help if I'm wrong, but certainly the cultural similarity, the religious similarity shields. But still, Mexico would be an interesting case. You say it doesn't shield, so you do have a problem, right? So, that very few countries escape it. Akansha, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so my point is that because we're living in such polarized times, is this agnostic confrontation the right approach to politics? Like, shouldn't we actually focus on strengthening our central political institutions and like regenerating a unified public sphere? Because without a consolidated center to, fight over, agnostic contestation may actually not revive democracy, but actually destroy it.
Yeah, well, of course, this is the issue that she wanted to deal with herself. She wanted to defend the institutions, right? Maybe add to them more direct democratic participation. She seems to want to add, although she does not come out for any specific arguments about referenda or recall or popular petitions and all the rest, but she seems to want to change them in some way. But on the whole, the thrust is to defend the institution. It's interesting because she puts it in terms of values, as the democratic imaginary, the imaginary significations we all share. But those institutions, those values require institutional processing. And now, we are on the threshold, especially on the right, of those institutions being challenged. I mean, you lose an election so obviously, right? And so then you want to stop Congress from counting. That's a pretty big challenge. It's, of course, after Chantal Mouffe's book, but one could foresee on the right. And of course, it existed on the left too, by the way. The idea of fake news. I mean, I grew up with leftist friends saying that, everything you read in the New York Times, Washington Post is just fake news. But it's not as if the left didn't used to think that there is no objective information because everything is structured by political commitment and allegiance. And so we can only listen to each other, not to them. So freedom of the press, which is a central institution, has been challenged before, but it is under challenge now, everywhere. And when they're in power, as Barbara will tell you, and Joanna will tell you, I'm sure elsewhere too, people have experience, when they're in power, they attack that. So institutions like courts, like the press, like local democracy, sometimes federalism. I mean, think about all the countries we know about in this class, and how many examples can we think among ourselves that those institutions are under attack. So I think Chantal Mouffe, without wanting to become too much of an institutionalist, wants to say that the left populist alternatives requires an institutional frame within which the new hegemony could be built. And it just happens that that's liberal democracy. Reformed, amended, improved, yes, but still it's liberal democracy. I mean, I find nothing wrong with this, of course, but people could say that's a pretty conservative argument at some level. And so, I think this is part of Udipta's criticism too, is that it treats capitalism and liberal democracy as entirely separable. And separating them, it loses sight of the fact that at least one part of that capitalism should be much more harshly criticized. And the fact that it is not is a proof that they're not separable entirely. In defending liberal democracy, Chantal Mouffe goes too far from Udipta's perspective in accepting capitalism. The best we can do is what social democracy did, is to make it more livable. Cesar, you have the hand up.
Yes, I have a question. Well, the last point was very interesting because how can I say this? The idea to separate the issue of conflict from the liberal democracy regime actually get rid of the main issue there, that you construct forms of legislation, of framework of legality, because actually you have those conflicts. The way that you solve this conflict is another issue, and it seems like Mouffe doesn't have any clarity about this issue. But my question is related with some of the points that Adipta raised related with this issue that Mouffe doesn't have any treatment, any specific treatment for non-developed economies or not developed societies, or the global south. And the problem is that in this context, as Latin America or other kind of countries, you have a lack of a specific idea of or the lack of institutions which realize the whole idea of citizenship, of democratic citizenship. And when you construct these initiatives commanded by the idea of a left populism, what we had in Latin America was the opposite effect of the construction of a new citizenship, as in the case of, as in the Venezuelan case, for instance. If we talk about the construction of a new hegemony, Chavez has had his own instrument, which was Aló Presidente. So those are the kind of problems that are related with this issue of not including this kind of exception of outliers cases. And in this sense, I think that she doesn't have a relevant treatment of the idea of citizenship and the idea of rights, which is, even though those are elements of liberal democracy, actually those are also very related, or those are implied in a whole idea of a radical democracy, actually.
Well, when it comes down to concrete ideas, she doesn't have a lot for Europe either. When it's actually, you ask the question of, so let's assume we come to power, and obviously we're going to try to build a new hegemony that transforms the cultural frame of society dramatically. Okay. But what about the older issues of the left? And I agree with Adipta that in a way, the conception is somewhat conformist in terms of capitalism, but the question back would be, well, what is the alternative to capitalism that one should be actually thinking of? And the answer is she doesn't have it. And this, of course, means that in terms of Cesar's question, she's not going to be able to contribute much to the debates in Latin America. On the political level, which is what you stressed, the reason she can't contribute much because she kind of accepts the populist frame. So to the extent that people are mobilized by Chavez, that is to her not in itself a problem. And I think in that sense, she follows the lead of Clau. In terms of asking the class, though, a question which is a counter question to your question, aren't we talking about all this now to some extent because, in fact, we don't really have very clear alternatives to established regimes, forms of government, even economic arrangements in any of the settings. Populism, in a way, isn't populism a way of creating a smokescreen which hides our own weakness about alternatives? social democracy was, Udipta criticizes it, but nevertheless, and I think his criticisms are all right, but nevertheless, it was a historical alternative. Import substitution was a historical alternative in Latin American countries, right? So there have been some historical options. Now, with globalization, we're in a position, yes, sure, we could think of alternatives that would mean isolating a country, a region, a group of countries from the world economy. But the costs of that would be extremely high from the very same point of view of social welfare and autonomy and movement. And if we don't isolate ourselves from it, then we are in a way in the golden straitjacket which it creates for us. And we're in this situation, and populism then creates a rhetorical response, which actually doesn't change anything, but at least for a while it seems to be bought by people that it will. Trust the leader. I know how to do it. You hear that from Chavez, you hear that from Trump. So populism creates an illusory set of answers to a set of problems to which neither the populists nor anybody else seem to have answered. And in that sense, it's not so much neglecting Latin America, which is the issue that you raised, which is a very serious problem for Chantal Mouffe, but it is rather not having alternatives of the type. Now, this is what the neoliberals tell us, right? TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. That we should not necessarily accept. But the answer is to try to imagine alternative forms of political arrangement, and populism short circuits that, because it seems to say there's no real problem here. You just put the right people who really embody the people as a whole, and things will go well. It could be that after 5 or 10 more years of this, no one will believe that. But lots of people believe it now. Yes, Ihor.
Thank you. If there is no one from the student body to ask a question, I'll use this opportunity. Actually, my question is for Udipta in a way, and it's very specific. It's on first sentence on the page 4. When you say, for the Clau, interesting question is how a people gets constituted. And it's precisely on the last word, constituted. And I would like to complicate it in terms of constituent and constituted power distinction. And my kind of sub-questions are 2. So it seems like for Mouffe and also for the Clau, this constituted power is abandoned. So we're only discussing the people, but not the institutional kind of arrangements which are supposed to follow, but they're out of picture. And the second is whether it's self-referential or, on the other hand, preliminary. So it's how the constitutive constitutes itself. So it's, I mean, the people, to mention your reference to democratic imaginary of modernity. So those concepts which are taken for granted and a nation are also constituted, and we're somehow kind of bound to self-referential contestation over the people, but without step forward to what the people will constitute eventually. So it's kind of, yeah.
This is the I think this was I guess I was addressing this in the paper, relying on Lefort's distinction between the political and politics, and I mean, we've discussed this before. I think that Clau and Mouffe are essentially arguing for the political against politics, politics in the sense of institutional issues, problems of administration, governance. These are not things that they're concerned about. So what they care about is precisely formulating the people, and there's a sort of belief that any formulation and construction of the people will open up different avenues for different forms of governance and administration. So what the people do is not an interesting question for them. In fact, for Clau, clearly, and this is where Andrew's work is very critical, and rightly so, that the people, once populism ends for Clau, once the people gets constructed. So there's no theory of populism in power, in government, or populism as regime. And these would be issues of concrete politics.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And there have been even people who have written on populism and constitutionalism who have argued that the only populist constitutionalism is that of the constituent power. And so the interest is in the political, understood in a very strong sense, but not necessarily in terms of Schmidt's friend and enemy concept, but as the constituent power. Of course, this is a lack because, then you come to power and then what? And you have to engage in politics, though you can have, as in Hungary, for example, I think Venezuela, and probably there are other cases of it I have to think about. There have been repeated attempts to use the constituent power, amending, changing, replacing judges. Constitutional politics remains on the agenda and kind of replaces constituted politics. This is, it's possible to try that. Joanna just had to leave, but Poland would be a case where it was more difficult to do this because there was not the famous constitutional amending majority. But still, they do it and they engage in it. But the problem, nevertheless, Ihor, is that you got to constitute something, but then at some point you constituted it, and then what? And then what? It's very interesting to watch Morales and Chavez, really grappling with this question. Then from Maduro, you'll really now see a caricatural version of it, but Chavez genuinely struggled with it. How long a time, assuming you had programs, which on the whole they don't, but assuming they had programs, the assumption is that it would take a long time to institute it. You can't just go in and out of power and do the job. You have to stay in power. So in that sense, one thing that happens is to change the constitutional framework in such a way that you can stay in power. You can do that by changing the electoral rule. You can do it by destroying the freedom of media so no one else can communicate even in elections. Barbara will recognize these things for Hungary. You can also change the constitutional system over and over again, as it's been done in Venezuela, and Morales has tried also. I'm not sure right now off the bat about Korea in Ecuador, but this is, that's the kind of thing you can do. But this is not really yet an answer to the fact that we need to generate alternatives about how to reorganize contemporary societies, and constantly referring to the constituent power is not the way. Yes, it makes sense, and I spent a lot of time on this myself, to spend some time about how the constituent power itself could be constituted. In other words, it's not enough to say, as did Napoleon Bonaparte, je suis le pouvoir constituant, I am the constituent power. That's unacceptable, right? So, you have to worry about how it is to be done. And it's not acceptable to just refer to Article 5 in the US, which is almost impossible to use, given the vetoes and all the rest that is built into it. So in some ways, constituent power has to be released, democratized, interpreted, and so on. So that's that. I think that I'm the last person to criticize the populist for having spent a lot of time on that. But then you do have to constitute something. Hannah Arendt is so important for me on this, right? Is that she actually tells you that, yes, you have to end it. It's possible even to have a constituted power that includes some of the energies and the aspirations and the normative gains that we have learned as we were constituting things. Condorcet spent a lot of time on trying to devise a scheme for this, and others historically have spent time on this as well. But the point is, nevertheless, that we also have to compete for power. We have to govern. We have to make policy decisions that have consequences. Not all of them do we know in advance, and all this requires, a different kind of theory than any populist has ever produced. They piggyback on the theories of others, but they do not produce. I don't think even the theories of the constituent power that they have produced are really ideal, although in some settings, for example, in the Bolivian case, the process remained relatively democratic and with lots of accountability and so on built into it. But still, even if you did do that, the problem that Igor raises, the problem of what to do with the constituted powers. How should you organize them? What should be part of them? How do you make people accountable? How should elections work? Are you going to have an election every day and replace people immediately, even after a week in power? Or are you going to have them very rarely so that people in power are no longer accountable? How do you mix these things? And what about the courts? I think Cesar mentioned law. I haven't seen constitutionalism is discussed sometimes by populists, but the law is generally an enemy. Is not really taken seriously. But how can you have elections which are free and fair without the rule of law? How can you have a free press without the rule of law? And who enforces that? So in this sense, populism perhaps emerges because at the moment we are so weak and impoverished in terms of our political, social, and economic theories. That's true, but populism has not filled that gap. And in that sense, we must think beyond populism. I mean, it's makes a lot of sense that the phenomenon is being analyzed by so many people right now, but it cannot be the end of the story.
Yeah, if I could add to this, yeah. So I think that there are two things here. One is obviously the sort of performative aspect of populism, which is that it contains a promise of some form of redemption, but it almost fails to deliver. And its failure to deliver results in it becoming more and more repressive, because it has to then contain and limit dissatisfaction.
That's the logic.
With its, and the other, the other, which is in Mouffe, Mouffe actually, towards the latter part of the text, does have some slightly vaguely formulated proposals. But what is interesting is that her argument is for a sort of Gramscian integral state. So it would essentially be social democracy. And then what you do is a molecular transformation of society, right? Which is passive revolution. You try to spread some form of civil life in civil society that is democratic. The point being, these are going to be slow, long-term reforms. They're not going to be drastic and immediate. And that will create, again, I'm not sure that solves the problem of centrism. So if the argument is, if you keep centrist, then the ghost of right populism will emerge again, the next election cycle. And if you are left populist, you come to power, and then you take on a project of gradual reform, even if the reform is in content more radical than what the centrists have proposed, it is nonetheless going to be gradual and not drastic. And if it's gradual, then it's not clear to me why there will not again also be dissatisfaction with the slow pace of change. And then this will again perhaps lead to a more vociferous right populist response.
Yeah, I think, both things you said are thought-provoking. Just a couple of words on the first, how the authoritarian logic may develop. You make promises, but these promises are very abstract. You don't really have genuine proposals, or what you propose is unviable. And so in the end, you have internal opposition, which you see. I mean, it would be interesting to look at even the normatively positive experience of Bolivia, how much opposition there is, even within the indigenous camp. It's not as if just white people oppose Morales or mestizos or whatever it is terms we should use for these different ethnic groups. All the fights are within each group too, and so in that sense, the difficulties of fulfilling promises and making contradictory promises and papering over promises with rhetoric, trust the leader who, after all, doesn't know, any more necessarily than lots of other people. These formulas lead to conflict, and authoritarianism is the response, because you really then don't want the press to be able to publicize all that. You don't want your electoral competitor to be in a better position now. I mean, after Venezuela, they lost the election, right? They had to change everything, create a new constituent assembly, try to reverse it. Chavez was popular. He could win elections, but then after 10, 15 years, things were not so positive. And international oil prices have something to do with it, but also internal mistakes, because you could deal with the resource better and in terms of a more long-term strategy than they did. So that's authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, I try to sometimes argue that it is built into the logic of at least the most contemporary populisms, but very likely those authoritarian elements could be counteracted by the democratic assumption and the democratic claims, but that failure reinforces the authoritarian side. So there is a real problem that every populist at some point will face. On the other issue that you discussed, I of course I'm unfair in trying to say that they have nothing to say about normal politics. I'm sure that in the various writings of Clau you'll find a lot of clues, and there are some clues toward the end of Chantal Mouffe's book, but they don't really add up to really a kind of program, and certainly don't add up to the idea that now that we're in charge, it means the people are in charge and the people are wise and they have no special interests to serve, and so things will go well. Fragments of a program, some of which, as you say, involve a long time to institute, do not settle the matter. The one dimension we're leaving out, but we'll turn back to it again, we have dealt with it with Danny Roderick, is that the problem they all face is that the issues have become international and global. And that means that to solve them in a single country like Venezuela, okay, so you have the high oil price for a decade. And so you can solve lots of issues in the short term. But that oil price depends on the world. Then what when it drops? In that sense, things are not really under your control except in a very short term. And this means unemployment, this means prices, this means the movement of capital from country to country. It means a lot of issues. In this sense, the Europeans ought to be very fortunate, right? Because the EU is big enough. The English, of course, the British, very insane to leave this because it was within the EU, that a lot of their issues could have been perhaps handled if the EU were reconstructed. But perhaps that is the clue that Latin Americans should also take seriously, namely that regionalism is the answer, because all of Latin America would, of course, also be big enough, and many other countries are quite wealthy now and have a lot of resources. So in this sense, solving the problems on the purely national level, maybe this is one of the reasons why it was unfortunate that Chantal Mouffe raised the issue of the nation, is to focus on a nation unless you have a world like India, which is not really like Denmark. I mean, really, in terms of the ability to deal with its own environment and its own issues. Unless you have the United States, even, then regionalism ought to be part of the solution. And in that sense, perhaps the fact that Chantal Mouffe is in Spain, or is at least operating together with Podemos, gives her some advantages, because that's the EU, and it's a very powerful grouping where reforms could be much more viable than if you just try to accomplish reforms in Venezuela alone or Ecuador alone and so on. Okay, so I think it is getting close to the end. We will talk about the issue, one of the issues you raised, the democracy issue formally, because though it is behind everything that Clau and Chantal Mouffe have done, we have not dealt with it enough systematically and comparatively. So we will.